Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Jammin with Gamin online. I believe this is episode 5. It's hard to keep track of pretty much everything during these days. As I'm recording this, it's a windy Monday morning. I have a little update for you first. I know that the school administrators are meeting this morning, and I think they're going to talk about what we might look like in terms of our online instruction going forward. We're under the assumption now we will probably have to extend our closure. I don't know that for sure. I don't think anyone does yet, but it does look likely that we'll have to do some online learning a little bit longer. So I believe that the administrators are going to meet and decide what it might look like if we have to do this longer term, what the expectations for you are, what their expectations for us are. So as soon as I know more, I will let you guys know. And we are supposed to have an online staff meeting for the high school tomorrow morning. So I'm assuming at that time I'll have more information to give you. But in the meantime, let's go back to our survey of music history. Today I wanted to talk about the classical era of music. If you remember from before spring break, we looked at sort of a timeline of Western music. We'd gotten as far as looking at the Baroque era. So just briefly, we don't have a lot of evidence of medieval music styles other than the Gregorian chants, and we can reproduce some of it, but not all of it. Uh, then we got into the Renaissance era, which is when we start to have more written music. We start to know a little bit more about the instruments and how they were performed and what context they were performed in. So, and then after that, the Baroque era, which as orchestra people, we would recognize as music that we still play today on a regular basis. A lot of the structure of modern music was set up during the Baroque era. So similarly, classical composers took the ideas from previous people and developed them a little bit more and in a different direction. Again, I've said it before, I'll say it again. The dates are very approximate. 1750 to 1820 is what a lot of scholars will tell you, but there were composers already working in very classical era traditions prior to 1750, and there were composers who continued to write in the classical vein after 1820. It's just ballpark. And if you're looking at a composer and trying to decide where they fit in terms of musical eras, I think it's more helpful to know about their style and what harmonies they used, what forms they used, rather than just looking at their birth and death dates, because that doesn't give you the same kind of picture. Uh, when people at that time talked about classical, they were thinking in terms of ancient Greek and Rome. It was very fashionable during the 18th century, during the 1700s, to admire ancient Greek and ancient Roman statuary and art and architecture, and they echoed a lot of that during the 1700s. You'll see it in a lot of buildings that they built with very Greek columns. A lot of you have been studying those, I know, in your history classes. Art and sculpture especially looked a lot like the kinds of things that you might find in a Greek or Roman temple. So it was just very fashionable, and that sort of reflected in the music, but not in terms of sounding like ancient Greek or Roman music, because they probably hadn't the faintest idea what that would have sounded like. We barely have ideas of that ourselves, and we have a lot more information than they do. So, but what they did think of was the structure, the order, and the decorativeness of it. That's what appealed to people who were living in the classical era, and they reflected that in their music. So in a lot of ways, it sounds cleaner, I guess, than Baroque era music. It's more delicate, and it's lighter in structure. Baroque music tends to be very big and heavy and monumental. Classical music lightened that up quite a bit. Again, composers vary, but that's sort of the general character of this time. Some of the changes in instruments and styles that were being used, orchestras became bigger and more like a modern orchestra that we might recognize. Instead of small groups of maybe mostly string players or mostly wind players, an orchestra became a good size, decent sized string section, and the addition of solo woodwind and brass players. You might have two or three flute players and a complement of 25 string players, say, just for an example. They started to mix in more. You start to see brass instruments and percussion instruments used along with the strings and winds as well at this time. The harpsichord finally fell out of favor and was replaced by the piano. Some of you may already know the original name of the piano was the pianoforte, and the big selling point for it was the first keyboard instrument that you could really change the dynamic level of. You could change the volume. So it could play both piano and forte, hence pianoforte, which ultimately became the forte piano, which ended up being what we just call the piano these days. Much more popular. It became more of a solo instrument at this time as well. And most of the instruments that we're using now evolved into either their modern forms or something very close to the ones we use today. String instruments are a great example of that. At the end of the Baroque era, they started to move away from some of the characteristics of string instruments that had been up to that point. The shorter fingerboards, the flatter bridges, the convex bows, those all changed. You got modern bows with the stronger concave design. You had longer fingerboards because they were expanding the range of instruments and how far up and down they would play. And the bridges changed shape to accommodate less polyphony. And if you remember, polyphony is when you have a lot of melodic material going on at once, to more of a homophony where there's a melody line and then a distinct harmony below it. So the arched bridge made it a little bit easier to play single lines on stringed instruments. The most valuable ones that we have come from the end of the Baroque and the beginning of the classical era. A lot of them were made in Cremona, Italy. You can think of the huge names, the names that you hear now. Stradivarius is the biggest name, of course, and supposed to be the most valuable instruments in the world. The Guarnerius family also made some beautiful instruments. Those are the instruments that you most often see copied by modern makers, or 19th century, 20th century makers for that matter. My instrument, for instance, is a Guarneri model. It was patterned after one of the Guarnerius violins that had been made by the Guarneri family in Cremona, Italy in the 1720s or so. Their Guarneris tend to be a little more aggressive than Stradivarius instruments. Stradivarius instruments are very graceful and light. They're also both extraordinarily expensive. I promise you that whatever old instrument that is in your grandma's attic or whatever, that's not a real Stradivarius. It might be a wonderful instrument. It could be a very valuable one by an important maker, but it's almost certainly not an actual Stradivarius. So you don't have like $3 million of instrument waiting in your attic for you. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. But again, that's not to say you don't have a lovely instrument. It's just not one of these. Another important violin maker, and one who was probably ahead of the curve, was Amati, the Amati family. And some of those appear in the latter part of the 1600s, the early part of the 1700s. Some of them are still in common use today, and they're also still extraordinarily expensive. So I mentioned earlier, the thing that makes classical music sound like classical music, and again, capital C classical, is that it's clearer and it's lighter. They were very concerned about elegance at that point. So rather than all the big heft of the Baroque era music that was all like that was complex and intellectual, the classical era was a little bit more free in that expression, but not as emotional as the Romantic era that followed it. So in terms of the structure that you would see, the parts become more clearly divided, and it usually they really liked having one distinct melody line and then other supporting harmonies. So a lot of that is things, again, you'll recognize when we work in rehearsal. Who's got the melody? Oh, this is a viola melody, so everybody else needs to back off so the violas can come forward. That's something that really started to take shape in the classical era. And a lot of of modern musical forms that we use today developed during that time. The sonata and sonata allegro forms, what became huge. And when I think of sonata, I think of a solo instrument and a piano. Sometimes it's just a solo instrument, but generally speaking, it features a soloist in some way. Symphonies, like we think of them now in the modern form, and one of the most important developments of the classical era was the rise of the string quartet, and one of my personal favorites because I dearly love string quartets. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Um, so because of that simpler texture, because we were looking at melody and harmony as opposed to a lot of interwoven melodies, composers needed a different way to add musical interest. So it started to be more important to think about dynamics and phrasing, and they did more nuance with that than they had in previous years. So some of you have played Baroque pieces, and we've noted that they have terraced dynamics, which are not terrorist dynamics. Terraced dynamics meaning that I was piano, now I am forte. I'm not gradually getting there. I'm just switching piano, forte. Oh, now I'm piano again. So in classical music, you start to see them use crescendos, gradual getting louder, or decrescendos, getting softer, sforzandi, where you have sudden big accents, all of those things that add interest without adding weight to the music, I guess, is the best way that you can think of it. So that's how a lot of classical era composers gave their specific character to their music. So let's talk about the most important classical era composers. As per usual, there were a lot of classical era composers that we won't touch on here. Antonio Salieri was important. The sons, there were three sons of Johann Sebastian Bach that became important, used to laugh at their dad actually and his old-fashioned music. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach being one of them. Johann Christian Bach was another who was fairly important. But the sort of the height, the epitome of classical composers was Franz Joseph Haydn. He worked primarily for a prince most of his life. He wasn't really a church musician. This is not to say he didn't write religious music, because he did, but mostly he wrote secular music. He wrote for entertainment and the balls or big concerts that his boss would throw. He wanted to show off that he had one of the most famous composers in the world. This is about the time that Vienna, Austria became the center of music and art at the time, and Haydn was right there in the thick of it. So Haydn wrote, I want to say around 104 symphonies. Don't quote me on that. But he was incredibly prolific. He wrote a ton of stuff. He was also the composer that originated and developed the string quartet in very much a modern form. Haydn's string quartets are wonderful. They're witty. Most of Haydn's music has this sort of twinkle in the eye. He liked to put jokes, sometimes obvious, like the equivalent of musical dad jokes are in some of Haydn's music, but some of it is also just amazing on its own. So I have a sample of one of his string quartets here to show you. Let's take a look. Where's my cursor? There it is. that is a good place to stop there because they're about to take a repeat probably. I like that performance because, as you can see, they're young people. They look to me like high school kids playing at an incredibly high level. That's a great example to me of a lot of the things I was just talking about in terms of the style of classical music. You hear it was very delicate. The string players are playing off the string, which is not something that really happened during the Baroque era. And there's elegance through it. It's the kind of thing that makes you assume you won't make eyebrows, like classical eyebrows, I think of them, where everything is lifted and elegant in that way. You also notice that the violin one, the first violin player, had a lot more to do than the other parts. And that speaks to that. Here is my melody line and everything else just kind of happens to it. Although Haydn was pretty good about sharing some of the wealth some of the time. So moving on to the second most famous composer of the classical era, that would be, well, I'd say the second most famous. He's probably the most famous composer, but he was sort of second chronologically, and that was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was one of Haydn's students for a while. He was a child prodigy. He could play a number of instruments. He was touring Europe on performing on piano and violin when he was 5 and 6 years old. He had a serious stage dad who was probably kind of exploiting his son for his talent, also drove him very hard. Mozart had a hard time living up to what his father hoped and expected for him. And it was an interesting character, really. Again, a lot of humor that comes through in his music and some of the loveliest pieces ever written. Mozart was so cheerful, musically speaking. He only wrote two symphonies in minor keys. And I happen to really enjoy those minor key symphonies. So I chose his 25th symphony. He wrote 41 overall. I chose this one to sample for you today. Some of you who are sophomores might recognize this as something we played last year. So there's a little bit of Mozart for you. And you can see, we talked about how the orchestras got larger. There's more string players involved, and you could hear and see the woodwind players. Not a tremendous amount of brass in that one, except, of course, for the French horns. Uh, but you can hear the development of that, how he's blending it more and more, and how the melody is usually clearly carried in one section or the other at any given time. So very much the height of classical style, a little bit of restraint, but also just a little glint in his eye in the music, and very delicate in terms of their technique. They aren't playing incredibly loud, but they are doing more dynamic references and making things a little more surprising that way. Now, the last classical era composer I chose to show you is a little bit different, not one that you'd necessarily hear about, but I'm trying to get away from all the old white guys, which is pretty much how most music appreciation types of courses go. Mauricio Nunez Garcia was a composer who was Brazilian, and he was of part African descent. So some of the earliest music that we still have from a Black composer, very much in the classical tradition. And he, I believe, was generally speaking a church musician. Let's take a look at what he did with vocals in the classical tradition. Right, little taste of that. So you can hear the same kind of things, a much thinner texture, very delicate and elegant in its structure and put together that way. Classical era music is really a lot of fun to play. It's does demand a little more of us sometimes than Baroque music, especially perfecting a spiccato off the string style, but it also is really rewarding to do. I would encourage you to seek out maybe some more of it. Look at some more of Haydn's symphonies or string quartets. Mozart also wrote a series of wonderful string quartets, and as well as his symphonies and violin concertos, all kinds of things that you can hear. The Haydn cello concerto is a terrific one to listen to for those of you who are lower string players. So check it out. In our next session, we're going to look at the early Romantic period and the composer who was responsible for transitioning us to that Romantic period, Ludwig van Beethoven. Hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.